So probably the most beloved, romanticized, and publicized archaeological site on the entire planet is the Pyramids of Giza. Now, obviously, there are many other pyramids in Egypt as well. If you didn't know that, there's somewhere between around 128 to like 140 pyramids, they estimate, in Egypt. Although some of them, many of them, have been deconstructed either in ancient times or medieval times or modern times to build new cities such as modern-day Cairo. But the Great Pyramids in particular and the pyramids of the Old Kingdom are probably the most enigmatic archaeological sites on the planet, maybe. They're certainly the most behemoth-like achievements ever achieved in ancient times. And we're going to talk about this today, but while the age of the pyramids is commonly disputed, even at the Great Pyramid's youngest date, which is somewhere around 2550 to 2560 BC, even if the pyramids are that young, that means that they were created at a time before the rest of the ancient world was really even kicking off. In 2500 BC, in ancient Greece, there wasn't very much happening. There was some beginnings of what would later be Minoan civilization on Crete, but throughout the rest of ancient Greece, these people were still living in the Stone Age. They did not yet have things like bronze tools, for example, or at least not to the extent that the ancient Egyptians during the Old Kingdom had. So before the rest of the ancient world was really even beginning, the Egyptians had built a building so tall and so massive that at no point in human history would another building be built taller until the creation of the Eiffel Tower in the 1800s. So at the very beginning of civilization, at the very beginning of at least recorded history, the Egyptians had achieved one of the most monumental building projects that human beings would ever attempt and ever achieve before the rest of the ancient world had even begun. There's no way that I can emphasize the significance and the magnitude of that enough. I'm not an engineer, I'm not an architect, and while I know that there are so many mysteries around how the Great Pyramids were built, these are not really questions, as far as the construction, are not things that keep me up at night because it's just so far out of my area of expertise. But I have a list of thus far unanswered questions about the Great Pyramids and the other pyramids in Egypt that have still never been answered by Egyptologists to a way that I can seem to be satisfactory, or archaeology in general has just not yet found adequate answers to these problems. And so today we're going to go through a list of 8 unanswered questions about the pyramids of Egypt that keep me personally up at night, things that I personally wonder about the pyramids. So for the last 80 years, the government has been adding fluoride to our water supply on our behalf, but all of a sudden states like Florida and Utah are passing laws to ban it, with many other states following suit. And activists like RFK have been warning us for years about the effects of excessive fluoride consumption. And the US National Toxicology Program actually admits that there is a connection between fluoride consumption and people with a lower IQ, as well as Alzheimer's and dementia. The truth is, there doesn't need to be anything added to our water. Humanity has survived for over 200,000 years from drinking naturally purified fresh water. But most of us don't have access to natural fresh water to drink from. So our only options really are cheap water filters that don't really work or overly expensive plastic bottles. But to fix this issue, I've partnered with CovePure. CovePure is a water filtration system that sits on your countertop. You don't have to install it or call somebody to set it up for you. You just fill it up with water, plug it in, and it gets straight to work. CovePure is certified to remove up to 99.9% of impurities in your faucet water. That means fluoride, arsenic, forever chemicals, whatever it is, all of it gets filtered out and it leaves you with clean, purified drinking water. And once you've tried CovePure, you'll never go back. It's the best tasting water I've ever had. And also what I love is I can set the temperature to whatever I want it to be. It can be hot, it can be cold, it can be warm, whatever temperature I want. But right now, I think I want it cold. And look, if you like fluoride, that's great. You can use toothpaste, you can use mouthwash, you can use other fluoride rinse, but it's insane that we're forced to have fluoride put into our water on our behalf. CovePure gives you the right to choose for yourself. Click the link in the description to get $200 off your CovePure today for a limited time only. Your future self will thank you, and thank you to CovePure for sponsoring this video. Now, back to the show. And question number one is, of course, how old exactly are the Great Pyramids? Now, there's so much debate and so many thoughts. There are people who think that the pyramids are 24,000 years old, 60,000 years old, 100,000 years old. There are people who think that it dates back to the end of the last ice age, somewhere around 11,600 years ago. There are people who think that they were constructed just before the Sahara went dry. And then of course there's the traditional idea that they were built during the time of the Old Kingdom underneath the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, or I should call the Sun Kingdom of Ra. Now, truth be told, there really is no actual hard evidence for the pyramids being older than the Old Kingdom itself. The only evidence that's used for this is the fact that we can look at the Great Pyramids. We can look at the data set that we have, the archaeological record that we have of the tools that the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom had at their disposal to build the Great Pyramids. And we can see that there is a disparity between the two, that at least our ability to use these tools would not be satisfactory to create the Great Pyramid. We can see this disparity here between the tools that they had and what they supposedly built. Now, people take that and they essentially think, well, there must have been another great lost ancient civilization that existed before the Egyptians, before the dynastic Egyptians, that achieved these feats, of which we haven't found any hard evidence of those cultures yet. I'm not saying that it 100% did not happen, or that there wasn't another civilization that lived in Egypt long before the dynastic and biblical Egyptians. I'm just saying we haven't found their bodies, we haven't found their trash, we haven't found them yet. That being said, Egyptologists attribute, let's say, the Great Pyramid to Khufu. Now, this comes from a variety of sources. You have other people who are buried around the Great Pyramid, such as the physician of Khufu, the head of Khufu's gangs, Khufu's lead architect, the dentist of Khufu. It goes on and on and on. And all of these mastaba tombs are found all around the Great Pyramid that seemingly and contextually point towards this great monument, as if all of these people are buried around a large monument and they all attribute themselves to the reign of Khufu, well, what must this monument mean? Well, it must mean that it's probably Khufu's tomb, right? That's how Egyptologists interpreted that. And there are some other things as well, such as the hieratic glyphs that have been found inside the relieving chambers that essentially say Khufu's gang was here. Although there's a lot of controversy over whether or not those are legitimate. The veracity of these hieratic glyphs are very much always in question. But then you have the carbon dating of the mortar between the stones that seems to be centuries older than they estimate Khufu to have lived. I don't really understand what exactly the explanation is there. I don't know how we solve this. Is it possible that the Great Pyramid was built in a time earlier than Khufu, but still within the Old Kingdom? And if that's the case, well, how much does that throw up in the air all of the chronology that we understand about the Old Kingdom? And while for the most part in most archaeological sites around the world, it's sort of somewhat easy to find a date for when something happened or when these particular people lived, what's much harder to figure out is the what, the how, and the why. And the why of pyramids bothers me a lot. Why a pyramid? A pyramid, the pyramid shape, why that? Where exactly does that come from? The traditional explanation is that Imhotep, who was the great architect of the pharaoh Djoser, wanted to create a larger and more fortified tomb for Djoser to pass into the afterlife. And he wanted to make it impenetrable. So he essentially took a mastaba, which is, imagine like a 1x3 unit tomb. and he expanded it to a 3x3 tomb. So it's a large square tomb. And what this prevented was tomb robbers from tunneling under the ground and getting down into the subterranean chambers. So he expands the size of the upper structure to make it even harder to tunnel down into. But then he has this revolutionary idea, or so the story goes, to take this mastaba and put a smaller mastaba on top of it. And then another one, and then another one, and then another one. And this essentially makes a pyramid. But this isn't for fortification. This isn't for added stability. It's not for anything other than being a monument. And this changes the essence of what a tomb is in Egypt. And even though this is a traditional explanation, I find this pretty fascinating, and I don't see any Egyptologists talking about this at all, at least not in this popular space. This is a radical transformation of what it means to build a tomb. You have now gone from a tomb that's meant to fortify and protect the pharaoh's body, as well as perhaps his treasured belongings, beneath this structure deep inside of the ground. And now the structure has become a monument to honor the pharaoh, to serve as a marker for his reign, to show how powerful he was. And even at the youngest date in history, this is the first time this ever happened in known civilization. So imagine that mental bridge that was crossed here. This is something that had never ever been done before. And then over time, the construction of pyramids becomes more elegant. Rather than, essentially what they do is they take these mastabas that are stacked on top of each other, which have this step undulating pattern, and they fill those in and they make that smoother and smoother and smoother until it's a perfect pyramid like we see on the Giza Plateau and Sneferu's pyramids out at Dashur. But it's not exactly that simple either, because earlier into the Old Kingdom and even into pre-dynastic times, there was something known as the Bin stone, which, imagine if you took an Egyptian obelisk and you cut the tip off and it's just this triangular pyramidal tip. Now, a lot of people, generally you think that the obelisk is kind of a transformation of a pyramid. It's not as large as a pyramid, and arguably it's easier to erect, although there are people who say that erecting the large obelisks could have been harder than building a pyramid, which is a pretty interesting thing in its own. Probably I'm gonna have to make an obelisk video as well. If you're not on to that whole mystery, it is fascinating. You may even find it more fascinating than pyramids. The obelisks, while they may be a transformation of the pyramids, that top of the obelisk is actually older. The idea of that top, that triangular stone, that triangular pyramidal stone, is actually older than the pyramids itself. It goes back to what's known as the Bin stone, which is this, we don't really know much about it. All we have is descriptions of it. But it was a pyramidal stone that used to sit within the sacred courtyards of early dynastic and pre-dynastic temples. So think about this. We're going back into early primordial periods, long before the time of the Old Kingdom. We're in early dynastic and pre-dynastic time now. So perhaps somewhere just before and after about 3000 BC. But really, we just don't know too much about the Bin stone. And I think about it and I wonder if there is a connection between this worshiping of the Bin stone and the creation of the pyramids. And the next thing I wonder is, if the pyramids are not tombs, then what are they? And I know that there are so many explanations that are thrown out there that the pyramids are power plants, that they're industrial chemical factories. None of these things am I an expert in, and none of which thus far have been definitively proven. Now, these things take a long time to prove, and it may not even be in my lifetime, or maybe somewhere towards the end of my lifetime that something like this is actually proved. And I'm open to all kinds of theories. But if they're not tombs, I wonder what exactly they are. Just like in my video about the Nazca mummies, where I throw out the idea that they're a hoax, I throw out the idea that they are alien bodies, what is a third explanation that can be thrown out there? Something that other people haven't proposed yet. This is my third explanation, that myself and one I think he was a German or French Egyptologist in the late 1800s who excavated Amenemhat III's tomb. He and I both agree that the pyramids may have been what are known as cenotaphs, which is it's not fully understood and it's hard to grasp because we're not ancient Egyptians, because we're not royal ancient Egyptians that were a part of their religious cult that had access to this sacred and esoteric religious, shamanic, spiritual knowledge that was kept off from the rest of the Egyptians and the rest of the ancient world. These are not things that we're privy to and that we're ever going to be able to understand unless we were speaking with the high priest or the pharaoh himself. But I wonder if these pyramids were not something that not only symbolically stood as a marker for the power of the pharaoh and the power of the Egyptian kingdom and empire beneath him, but if it is not a symbolic, esoteric, maybe it isn't even symbolic, maybe it is the literal burial place of the sacred and divine part of the pharaoh's soul. This is a very Egyptian thing. You would have the Ka and you would have the Ba. And like, look at a pharaoh's name, Min Ka Ra. It means the sacred or the vital essence of Ra. So that Ka, that is the essence of Ra in Menkaura. So he has these two essences. He has himself and he has the God living within him. And it makes sense to me, the more that I've studied Egyptian culture, that the Egyptians may have taken this so seriously, or they may have been dialed in or tuned in to something that we are just calloused to in the modern world, where it made sense that you would build this huge marker. And there's so many places we can go with this, but it makes sense to me that you would build this huge marker, this huge tomb, this place where the inner chambers were elevated above ground. Because keep in mind, the ancient Egyptians, since the beginning of time, were always burying their dead below ground. All of the pharaohs would be buried up to this point in the Old Kingdom, would be buried down in Abydos, and they'd be buried in these horizontal or diagonal vertical subterranean chambers beneath the ground. And it's only during the time of the 4th dynasty that they move north, and supposedly they start building these tombs in the north that are elevated above ground. And the idea here is that the pharaoh was now seeing himself as a god and didn't want to be buried below ground, but changed it to be buried above ground, because he is now he's not only the high priest of the god in the same way that the pharaohs were back in primordial times, he is now intertwined with the god, which means he needs to be buried above ground. But I wonder if that's not wrong. This is just my theory. I think that those pharaohs still saw themselves as the high priest, and perhaps the sacred essence of the god Ra lived within them, but yet their physical body would still need to be buried down in Abydos along all of the other kings of the Old Kingdom and the early dynastic period and the pre-dynastic period, and that the vital essence of their body would somehow, in some way that we can't comprehend, a procession would be carried out by the sacred cult of Ra, and the pharaoh's vital essence would be buried inside the pyramid. So the pyramid was never actually ever intended for the pharaoh's physical body. And that's why when you walk through the pyramids, you can tell that this is not a place where people are meant to be walking through. It's not a place for people to be entering and coming and going. And so my very long-winded idea, and the thing I wonder, is if the pyramids were never actually intended for the pharaoh's physical body, but it was some other kind of burial that had to do with the cult of Ra that we just can't really understand. And the next thing I wonder about, if I'm not just crazy and the pharaohs really were physically buried in the pyramids, is why are so many of the sarcophagi in the pharaoh's pyramids so underwhelming? They're not that nice. I have been through so many of the Old Kingdom pyramids, and I have seen other Old Kingdom sarcophagi that were built for princes and princesses and other high-ranking officials who have sarcophagi that are much nicer than what the pharaoh himself has given. That are actually, you can go to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and you can see other 4th dynasty pink Aswan or red Aswan granite sarcophagi that are inscribed with sacred glyphs going up and down, and you can see the name of who's supposed to be buried in there with these magical spells, essentially blessing them in the afterlife. And these are much nicer sarcophagi than the sarcophagus that's found in the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid. And this is true for so many of the other pyramids as well. So why are the pharaohs given uninscribed sarcophagi inside their pyramid that are much more shoddy than people who were not nearly as wealthy as the pharaoh himself was? I mean, you have to think, the pharaoh himself was the actual living embodiment of the god Ra. He was not only wealthy, he was all-encompassing. He owned all of Egypt. But yet you have so many of these other people who have much more magnificent burial sarcophagi than the pharaoh himself had. And these sarcophagi actually had these people's names carved in them, which the pharaohs don't have in many cases. Why that is, I have never seen an adequate explanation for. And I'm up for an explanation. I've asked Egyptologists about this before, and hopefully someday I get some kind of answer. And my fifth question, which I kind of covered in question 4, is just the lack of inscriptions. There's this common misconception among people who kind of myth bust this, where they say, oh, well, you know, during this Old Kingdom time period, it wasn't really the time period in Egyptian history where they are inscribing the interior of tombs to the degree that they will later on during the New Kingdom. If you want to go see a heavily inscribed tomb that has a lot of decoration, it has the pharaoh's name all over the tomb, then you should go to the Valley of the Kings and go down into those tombs and check them out. Well, this is kind of not an explanation, because the New Kingdom is more than 1,000 years later, and it's in some ways it's a kind of a new civilization. It's a revolution, a twice removed revolution of the Old Kingdom, because you have the Old Kingdom, it collapses into the first intermediate period. You have the Middle Kingdom, that collapses again into the second intermediate period, and then the New Kingdom begins, and that is with Ahmose I, that's the founding of the Valley of Kings. Far, far removed. I mean, that's around 1500 BC, and the Old Kingdom collapses around 2100 BC. So this is 600 years later, twice removed. Comparing them doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially given the fact that the Great Pyramid is attributed to the early 4th dynasty, but if we go back into the 3rd and even the 2nd dynasty, going back to 2700 BC, 2800 BC, really pushing back to the earliest era, to the earliest centuries of the Egyptian world, we do find mastaba tombs that are made out of mud brick, where the interior is actually decorated and the walls are painted and there are inscriptions on the walls and there are statues in there with early dynastic glyphs. These tombs were being decorated, and yet the Great Pyramid, the greatest achievement of all of the Egyptian world architecturally, has no adornment on the interior whatsoever. This is a huge mystery to me. Now, the Valley Temple of the Great Pyramid either exists or it doesn't exist anymore. If it does, it's not accessible because it's underneath modern-day Cairo. And then the Valley Temple of Khafra exists, but it's unadorned. And then the Valley Temple of Menkaura exists, but it seems to be unadorned, which makes you think that even down at the Valley Temples, there are no hieroglyphs. But this isn't exactly true, that even including the Valley Temples were not adorned. There is a Valley Temple that connects to the Red Pyramid. Very, very few people have ever been out there. I have never seen a YouTube video that shows details of the Valley Temple. But I was given permission to go down there in October. And there were a lot of large limestone and sandstone, like megalithic blocks there, nothing granite that I could see, and they were completely unadorned. There were no hieroglyphs, there was nothing there. Until I was my second time in Egypt, I was there for the opening of the Grand Egyptian Museum. And when I went up into the section of the Old Kingdom, I went to the 4th Dynasty gallery, there were these reliefs that were put on display, and they were from the Valley Temple of Sneferu's Red Pyramid, where I had gone and visited. So sometime during the colonial period, they were cut off and removed, but it shows a procession of people bringing Sneferu gifts. And what this tells us is that the valley temples were actually adorned with hieroglyphs and decorations that are essentially, a valley temple is a temple that connects straight to the Nile, or a tributary or a canal from the Nile, and you have this causeway that goes straight up to the pyramid. So it's connected to the pyramid within the same complex. So the Red Pyramid, down the causeway to the Red Pyramid's Valley Temple, that's where I went. And then when I went to the Grand Egyptian Museum, I saw the reliefs and the stucco that used to be there, showing Sneferu receiving offerings from people throughout the Egyptian world, as well as around the greater world, all the way up to Lebanon. So what this shows is that these valley temples were actually being adorned with glyphs. They did definitively mention the name of the pharaoh, and yet inside the pyramid, on the same type of stone, the sandstone and the limestone, the same stone that's being used in the Valley Temple, there is nothing whatsoever depicting the pharaoh responsible for this monument. Now, that's one of two things. Either the pyramid was built by a completely different civilization and the Egyptians never had access to the interior, they never raided the interior of the pyramids to deface them or anything like that, because we see no evidence of that. So the pyramids are older than dynastic Egypt. Or the second explanation is that the pyramids are built for a completely different purpose than we even understand. Something that was removed from being built solely for the burial of the pharaoh. Maybe something more important than that. And while we're in Dashur, we should talk very quickly about this 3-pyramid problem. So you have the pharaoh Sneferu, who essentially revolutionizes the industry of pyramid building in ancient Egypt. He starts out in Maidum with the collapsed pyramid, and essentially the story goes is that they were trying to build the first smooth side perfect pyramid. However, they essentially built like a tower, this structural tomb tower on the inside, and the outer blocks, including the casing stones, were not interlocked together. And so what happened is that the foundation began slipping, and it's as if the stones slipped off of the inner structure inside of the pyramid and crumbled away. And that's kind of what it looks like today if you go see it. And there's almost no doubt that there was some kind of structural failure there. The real question is whether or not Sneferu was actually responsible for this pyramid, and why that's held in such contention, you'll see in a moment. So as the story goes, he moves on from Maidum all the way up to Dashur, and he starts on what we see today as the bent pyramid. And yet there's another problem. The angle of the pyramid is too steep, and when you see the bent pyramid, it actually visually looks like the largest pyramid in all of Egypt. It legitimately looks way bigger than the Great Pyramid itself because of how steep the walls are, and the fact that because they're so steep, you can't really pull the blocks out. The blocks can't be stolen. The outer casing stones, this fine Tura white limestone, is really strategically and at an angle placed into the structure of the pyramid. It's just magnificent looking at it. The pyramid looks gigantic. But the slope of the pyramid is so steep that they realized that for one structural reason or another, they wouldn't be able to finish the pyramid, which that's a whole other thing. It's highly contested over whether or not that bend, that change in the steepness of the pyramid is intentional or not. But the traditional theory is that it was not stable, or they didn't feel like they would have the ability to complete it at this angle, so they flattened the angle, and that's why we call it the bent pyramid. It has this bend in it. Now, that explanation does not make sense, that with it being so steep, it wouldn't, the structure might collapse, because it's a tourist site today, and thousands of people go in and out of the Great Pyramid every year. I would probably say over 10,000 people go in and out of the bent pyramid every year. So each of these take approximately 20 years. So he's now 40 years deep into his reign of building his pyramids. We don't know exactly how old he was when he became pharaoh, but he must have probably been at least 20 or so. So from 20 to 40, he's working on the Maidum pyramid. From 40 to 60, he's working on the bent pyramid. Now he's 60 years old and he starts the red pyramid again. This guy's really, really on a roll. And the red pyramid, as far as we can tell, goes smoothly. And they call it the red pyramid because of the red limestone that it's made out of. When the sun hits it in the night and in the morning, it's just gleaming red, especially on a clear day. And so the three pyramid problem is that if the construction of each pyramid takes 20 years, that's a 60-year building phase, which just seems unfeasible. Even though we don't have a perfect idea of how long Sneferu's reign was, it's really pushing the limits of what we know his reign could have been. And in some cases, according to some Egyptologists and people who study the chronology of the pharaohs, that building phase is actually longer than his rule even lasted. So this is the three pyramid problem: is really, could Sneferu have been able to achieve building three massive pyramids throughout the course of his reign? Or is he possibly responsible for only one or two of them, and one or two of the pyramids are being misassigned to him and should really be assigned to other pharaohs whose identities we don't know thus far, or whose identities should really be elevated in the Egyptian chronology? So question number 7, something we kind of touched on earlier, is, are the pyramids really meant to be entered? When you go into the bent pyramid, I should say the bent pyramid is by far the most difficult pyramid to get in and out of. The entrance is extremely vertical. It's extremely steep, and as you go down and down and down, when you enter into the entrance and you look down at the bottom, you cannot see the bottom. It goes so far down into the pyramid and then into the ground that you cannot see the bottom from the top. And as you go down, the corridor becomes more and more narrow, and it's only about maybe 3 feet tall or so, maybe I would say probably maybe 3.5 feet tall. And so there's no way to comfortably go down the pyramid. You can't walk down it like a stair step. You can't really go backwards and hunch over. It's like this perfect in-between area where it is uncomfortable going down the pyramid no matter what way you try to go down and descend. And your legs feel it by the time you've gotten to the bottom. And while you're down there, you really take your time because you know going back up is going to be even more excruciating. And so as I'm doing this, I'm thinking the entire time, this is so impractical. Bringing the body of the most high being that exists on the planet at this time down through these shafts is completely impractical. There must be something else here. And there's also the idea that the inside of the pyramids could have been cult worshiping centers. I've been in all of the major pyramids, and I just don't think that this is practical whatsoever, especially considering the portcullises that are meant to seal off the entrances of many of the pyramids. I don't think that they were pyramids that were meant for coming in and out of, but it's still something that intrigues me. Were the pyramids intended at all to be entered on multiple occasions, or were they meant to only be entered once after its completion to perform some kind of task, some kind of ritual, something, and then exit and close the pyramid? This is something that I often wonder. And getting down to the wire here, question number 8 is not so much how they moved the stones. I can imagine moving the stones on a flat surface, whether you're moving it across the sand or whether you're moving across the bedrock, and which my idea is they would probably clear away the sand until you got to the bedrock, flatten the bedrock and make like a causeway or a road, or you build a causeway to pull the blocks up. But one of the real questions for me is sailing the stones. When you travel from Cairo all the way down to Aswan, as I did by train, most people fly and then take a bus. I did it by train, and that was 11 hours, or maybe it was 17 hours. I think it was a long time. It was somewhere between 11 and 17 hours. A tremendously long, uncomfortable train ride, but I had a blast doing it. But I was thinking the entire time just how long an expedition all the way up from Memphis, which is modern day Cairo, down to Aswan to retrieve stones and then bring them back would actually be, and how difficult that would be to pull off. Now, the main question for me is, and this becomes even more true when we begin talking about obelisks in a later video, is how do they transfer the stones from the ground onto the boat without sinking the boat? I know we see depictions and we see theoretical illustrations of blocks on these river boats going up and down the Nile, sometimes with other tugboats, but I would love to see this done in practice. I would love to see somebody try to recreate just how they take these megalithic stones. Sometimes, so you know, the average limestone block used in the pyramids is somewhere between 1 to 2.5 tons. That's average. That's gigantic. And some of the limestone blocks, because they don't have the density and the mass of granite, they're absolutely enormous, but they don't have the same weight that granite does. But you have slightly smaller stones, and when I say slightly smaller, I still mean gigantic stones that are up in the ceiling of the king's chamber that weigh upwards of 80 tons apiece. And the red Aswan granite stones used in the Great Pyramid are all between 20 and 80 tons each. I would love to see the means by which these are quarried in Aswan and then loaded onto a ship without sinking the ship. Now, something I asked to see if these stones were really being sailed while I was in Egypt was I asked an Egyptologist who was traveling with us, has anything ever been done to scan the bottom of the Nile River for fallen stones? Surely there must be a giant obelisk that they somehow failed to correctly transport that slips off the side of the boat and goes down into the Nile and is never retrieved again, or some other large granite stones or what have you. And to my surprise, I was told by this Egyptologist that LiDAR scans or sonar scans into the water have been done, and there are times when the water is so low that if there were any large stones at the bottom of the river, people would have found them by now. People would know that they were there, and apparently no such stones exist. But sailing the stones is a great mystery, and it becomes even more mysterious when you get into the obelisks. There is this popular depiction of these obelisks on Hatshepsut's barge these are red Aswan granite obelisks that are erected in the Temple of Karnak. There are 2 of them there, and there was apparently one more that we think that she was trying to quarry out of Aswan that cracked in half, but that's the unfinished obelisk. That's a video for another day. But there are these famous depictions of these obelisks on a large barge, but they are modern drawings of how this obelisk was moved, and I have never actually seen a legitimate photo of the relief inside an Egyptian temple. I've only ever seen the modern recreation of this obelisk barge. So this is a big mystery here, and now that I'm talking about it, I really think that the obelisks probably deserve their own video. I think you guys would probably find the obelisks pretty interesting. So those are the 8 questions about the pyramids that tend to keep me up at night and staring at the ceiling in the pitch black darkness, just turning over in my head over and over and over for probably the last decade or more. If you guys have any questions about the Great Pyramids or the pyramids in Egypt in general that you would like answered, leave them in the comment section below. And if you have any insight on anything I was talking about, please let me know in the comment section below. I'm Luke Caverns. If you'd like more videos on the history and mysteries of places all around the world, well, please like and subscribe for more.